Now, if we talk about sensory memory at first, that is the first stage. Now, it refers to the brief storage of sensory information. Sensory memory is a memory buffer that lasts only very briefly, and thus, unless it is attended to and passed on for more processing, is forgotten. The purpose of sensory memory is to give the brain some time to process the incoming sensation and to allow us to see the world as an unbroken stream of events rather than an individual piece. Now, visual sensory memory is known as iconic memory. Iconic memory was first studied by the psychologist George Sperling in 1960. In his research, Sperling showed participants to display a letter of rows and similar to that UG, JX, PJ, MB, FC, AL, like that. On average, the participants could remember only one quarter of the letters yet seen. Sperling reasoned that the participants had seen all the letters but could remember only very briefly, making it impossible for them to report them all. To this idea, in his next experiment, he showed the same letters, but then after the display had been removed, he signaled to the participants to report the letters from either the first, second, or third row. In his condition, the participants now reported almost all the letters in that row. This finding confirmed Sperling's hunch. Participants had access to all the letters in their iconic memories, and if the task was short enough, they were able to report on the part of the display he has asked them to do so. The short enough is the length of iconic memory, which turns out to be 250 milliseconds, that is 1/4 part of a second. That's very, very quick. Now, what's the matter about short term memory? Most of the information that gets into sensory memory is forgotten, but information that we turn our attention to with the goal of remembering it may pass into the short-term memory. Short-term memory STM is the place where small amounts of information can be temporarily kept for more than few seconds, but usually for less than 1 minute. Information in short-term memory is not stored permanently but rather becomes available for us to process, and the processes that we use to make sense of, modify, interpret, and store information in STM are knowingly as working memory. Although it is called memory, working memory is not a storage of memory like STM, but rather a set of memory procedures or operations. Now, to accomplish a difficult task, we must need a variety of skills. We clearly need to use STM, and we must keep the letters in storage until we are asked to list them in an experiment. Now, short-term memory is limited in both the length and the amount of information it can hold. As said by Peterson and Peterson in 1959, found that when people were asked to remember a list of 3-letter strings and then were immediately asked to perform a distracting task like counting backwards by threes, the material was quickly forgotten, such that by 18 seconds it was virtually gone. One way to prevent the decay of information from short-term memory is to use working memory to rehearse it. Maintenance rehearsal is the process of repeating information mentally or out loud with the goal of keeping it in memory. We engage in maintenance rehearsal to keep something that we want to remember, like a person's name, email address, or phone number, in mind long enough to write it down, use it, or potentially transfer it to long-term memory. If we continue to rehearse information, it will stay in STM until we stop rehearsing it. But there is also a capacity limit to STM. Try reading each of the following rows of numbers, one row at a time, at a rate of about one number each second. Then when you have finished each row, close your eyes and write down as many of the numbers as you can remember. If you are like the average person, you will have found that on this test, a working memory known as a digit span test, you did pretty well up to the about 4th line, and then you started having trouble. I bet you missed some of the numbers in the last 3 rows and did pretty poorly on the last one. Now, the digit span of most adults is between 5 and 9 digits, with an average of about 7. So one way we are able to expand our ability is to remember things in STM by using a memory technique called chunking. Chunking is the process of organizing information into smaller groupings, chunks, thereby increasing the number of items that can be held in STM. So now this was much about STM, short-term memory. But How can we remember? That is cues to improving memory. Although it is useful to hold information in sensory and short term memory, we also rely on our long term memory. We want to remember the name of a new boy in the class, the name of the movie we saw last week, and material for our upcoming psychology test. Psychological research has produced a great deal of knowledge about long term memory, and this research can be useful as you can try to learn and remember new material. Now, in this particular section of the chapter, we will consider the question in terms to the types of processing that we do on the information we want to remember. To be successful, the information that we want must be encoded, stored, and then retrieved. What do we mean by this? Encoded is, first of all, we should understand the information that comes to us by heart. Then we should store it in our mind. And when we need it, it should come back, it should echo back to our minds through our tongue or through whichever form we want to transmit the information further. Now, what's about encoding and storage? How our perception becomes memories. Encoding is the process by which we paste the things that we experience into memory. Unless information is encoded, it cannot be remembered. I'm sure you've been to a party where you've been introduced to someone and then maybe only a second later you realize that you do not remember the person's name. Of course, it is not really surprising that you can't remember the name because you probably were distracted and you could never encode the name to begin with. Not everything we experience can or should be encoded. We tend to encode things that we need to remember and not bother to encode things that are irrelevant. Now, one way to improve our memory is to use better encoding strategies. Now, some ways of studying are more effective than others. Research has found that we are better able to remember information if we encode it in a meaningful way. When we engage in elaborative encoding, we process new information in the ways that make it more relevant or meaningful. So, rather than simply trying to remember the schools and their characteristics, you might be able to relate the information to things you already know. Many things are based on our prior knowledge and memory. But what's about retrieval? Even when information has been adequately encoded and stored, it does not do us any good if we cannot retrieve it. Retrieval refers to the process of reactivating information that has been stored in memory. We can get an idea of the difficulty posed by retrieval by simply reading one of the words but cannot not the categories of the sidebar below to someone. Tell the person that after you have read all the words, you will ask her to recall the words. After you read the list to your friend, give her enough time to write down all the words and that she can recall. Make sure that she cannot recall anymore and then for the words and that they were not listed. Prompt your friend with some of the category names. Do you any words that were furniture? Do you remember any words that were tools? I think you will find the category names which serves as retrieval cues. Will help your friend remember information that she could not retrieve otherwise. So sometimes there are a few hints that we need just to be back in our memory.